The gavel froze mid-air in Judge Margaret Webb's weathered hand, her 40 years of courtroom experience shattered by what she witnessed below. 6-year-old Grace Sullivan raised one trembling finger in a barely visible signal to the massive German shepherd beside her, and Bear's thunderous growl shook every soul in the packed federal courthouse. 300 spectators gasped in unison as the scarred police dog locked his golden eyes on defendant Thomas Mitchell, whose confident smirk dissolved into pure terror. Court stenographer Helen Rodriguez dropped her fingers from the keys, watching Bear's hackles rise like warning flags. The bailiff's hand instinctively moved to his weapon. Rebecca Sullivan clutched her chest, remembering her daughter's voice, silenced for 8 agonizing months since that spring afternoon when evil came calling. Now this broken child and her 4-legged guardian were speaking a language only they understood. "This court will recess immediately," Webb commanded, though her voice cracked with emotion she hadn't felt since losing her own sister decades ago. What truth had that dog just recognized? And why was the man who destroyed an innocent child's voice now trembling like a cornered animal? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 months earlier, Grace Sullivan had been the kind of child who filled every corner of her family's Denver home with endless chatter and infectious laughter. At 6 years old, she possessed that rare gift of finding magic in ordinary moments, turning cardboard boxes into castles, having tea parties with imaginary friends, and asking her mother Rebecca 1,000 questions before breakfast. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with curiosity about everything from why clouds moved to where butterflies went when it rained. Rebecca Sullivan, a former elementary school teacher, had devoted herself entirely to nurturing Grace's boundless imagination after leaving her career 3 years ago. She read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, helped Grace paint masterpieces that covered the refrigerator, and marveled at her daughter's ability to remember every detail of every fairy tale. Michael Sullivan, Grace's father, worked long hours in what the family believed was corporate consulting, though his frequent travel and late-night phone calls had begun to strain their once perfect marriage. Their suburban Denver neighborhood epitomized American family dreams. Tree-lined streets where children rode bicycles safely, neighbors knew each other's names, and the biggest worry was whose turn it was to host the block party. The Sullivans' 2-story colonial home sat on Maple Street, complete with a white picket fence and Rebecca's prized rose garden. Grace's bedroom window overlooked the backyard where she spent countless hours on her swing set, often talking to herself in elaborate storylines that only she could follow. Bear, the 9-year-old German shepherd who would later become Grace's lifeline, lived 20 miles away at Dr. Sarah Chen's Animal Rehabilitation Center. 3 years earlier, Bear had been one of Denver's most elite K-9 officers, specializing in tracking missing children with an almost supernatural ability to follow scent trails that had gone cold. His impressive record included 17 successful recoveries, making him a legend within the police force. But Bear's career ended abruptly during a night raid to rescue a kidnapped 8-year-old girl. While pursuing a masked suspect through an abandoned warehouse, Bear had cornered the perpetrator in a dark basement. The man had slashed at Bear's face with a hunting knife, leaving a jagged scar that ran from his left ear to his muzzle. Though Bear successfully subdued the attacker and saved the child, his injuries went deeper than the physical wound. He developed what veterinarians recognized as canine PTSD, nightmares, anxiety around strangers, and an inability to focus during training exercises. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had dedicated her life to animal-assisted therapy after losing her own daughter to a trafficking ring 5 years earlier, saw something special in Bear's gentle spirit despite his trauma. She fought the police department's decision to euthanize him, arguing that his intelligence and protective instincts could serve a different purpose. Under her careful rehabilitation, Bear learned to channel his protective nature into therapy work, though he still carried the emotional scars of that night when he couldn't prevent a child suffering. Neither Grace nor Bear knew that their worlds were destined to collide in the most heartbreaking and ultimately healing way possible. The morning of April 15th began like any other perfect spring day in suburban Denver. Grace Sullivan bounced down the stairs in her favorite yellow sundress, the red silk ribbon that Rebecca had woven through her golden curls, catching the sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. She chattered excitedly about the butterfly she'd spotted in the garden the day before, wondering aloud if it would return to visit her flowers. "Mama, do you think butterflies remember people?" Grace asked, swinging her legs from the breakfast table chair while Rebecca packed Michael's travel bag. He was leaving for another week-long business trip, the third one that month. "I think they remember kindness, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, though her attention was divided between Grace's endless questions and Michael's hurried departure. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked his phone obsessively, but attributed it to work stress. Michael kissed Grace's forehead and hugged Rebecca goodbye, his embrace lasting longer than usual. "Keep the doors locked," he whispered to Rebecca. "I know it sounds paranoid, but humor me." After Michael left, Rebecca allowed Grace to play in the backyard while she tackled the morning dishes. The fenced yard had always been Grace's sanctuary, a place where she could spin in circles until dizzy, have conversations with ladybugs, and create elaborate games that only made sense in her 6-year-old imagination. Rebecca could see her daughter through the kitchen window, twirling in her yellow dress like a miniature sunflower. At exactly 3:42 p.m., Rebecca's phone rang. Her sister Jennifer was calling from Portland, excited about her recent engagement. Rebecca stepped into the living room for privacy, thinking the conversation would last only a few minutes. Through the window she could still see Grace playing near her favorite climbing tree, the red ribbon in her hair fluttering like a small flag of innocence. "Jen, that's wonderful news," Rebecca said, genuinely happy for her sister, but eager to return to watching Grace. "Tell me everything about the proposal." 4 minutes. That's all it took for evil to slip through the cracks of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. When Rebecca returned to the kitchen window, Grace was no longer alone. A man in dark clothing knelt beside her daughter near the garden gate, which stood slightly ajar. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see his smile, too wide, too practiced, too knowing. Her maternal instinct screamed danger before her mind could process what she was witnessing. "I have some puppies in my van," Thomas Mitchell was saying to Grace, his voice honey-smooth and perfectly calibrated to appeal to a child's desire to help. "They're very special puppies, and they need a little girl like you to take care of them. Would you like to see them?" Grace's natural compassion, the very quality that made her so precious, became her vulnerability. "Are they hurt?" she asked, her blue eyes wide with concern. "I could help them feel better." Rebecca dropped the phone, Jennifer's voice still chattering about wedding plans as the device clattered to the floor. She ran toward the back door, but the 30 feet between the kitchen and the garden felt like miles. Time stretched and compressed, each second both eternal and too quick. "Emily!" Rebecca screamed, using Grace's middle name in her panic. "Get away from her!" Thomas Mitchell's head snapped up, his practiced smile vanishing to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Grace's small wrist. The child's face transformed from curiosity to confusion to terror as she realized the man's grip was too tight, his intentions too dark. Grace didn't scream. Some primitive survival instinct seemed to freeze her vocal cords, leaving her wide-eyed and silent, as Thomas began pulling her toward the black van idling at the curb. Her yellow dress caught on a rose bush, tearing slightly, the red ribbon slipping from her hair, to fall among the flowers like a drop of blood on sunshine. Across the street, 78-year-old Dorothy Kim was returning from her daily walk when she witnessed the unfolding nightmare. "Hey!" she shouted with surprising force for her age. "Get away from that child!" The interruption startled Thomas just enough for his grip to loosen. Grace yanked her arm free and ran toward her mother with surprising speed, her small legs carrying her across the yard while Thomas hesitated, calculating whether to pursue or escape. Rebecca caught Grace in her arms, feeling her daughter's small body trembling like a frightened bird. But when she looked into Grace's eyes, she saw something that would haunt her dreams for months to come. The light had gone out. The chattering, curious, endlessly questioning little girl had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, leaving behind a silent shell that looked like Grace, but no longer sounded like her. Thomas Mitchell gunned the van's engine and disappeared down Maple Street, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt and an invisible scar on a family's soul that would take months to begin healing. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Grace Sullivan simply stopped speaking. Not gradually, not with occasional whispers. She went completely silent, as if someone had severed the connection between her thoughts and her voice. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Rebecca initially thought her daughter was in shock and would recover within hours. But as days turned into weeks, Grace's silence deepened into something far more troubling. Dr. Amanda Rivers, the child psychologist recommended by Grace's pediatrician, diagnosed selective mutism triggered by severe trauma. "It's her mind's way of protecting itself," she explained to Rebecca and Michael during their first consultation. "Grace has associated speaking with vulnerability, so her subconscious has essentially shut down that function to keep her safe." The sessions with Dr. Rivers proved frustratingly ineffective. Grace would sit in the cheerfully decorated office, staring at the toys and art supplies with vacant eyes, completely unresponsive to gentle encouragement or play therapy techniques. She drew occasionally, dark, angular shapes that bore no resemblance to her previous colorful artwork, but remained locked in her silent world. Michael returned from his business trip to find his chattering, inquisitive daughter transformed into a ghost of herself. What Rebecca didn't know was that his consulting work was actually deep undercover FBI operations targeting child trafficking rings. For 5 years, he had pursued monsters like Thomas Mitchell, driven by cases that haunted his sleep. Now, the very evil he fought professionally had invaded his home, stealing his daughter's voice and shattering his family's sense of safety. "We should have moved years ago," Michael told Rebecca one evening as they watched Grace sit motionless in her bedroom, no longer playing with toys or showing interest in her beloved fairy tale books. "I knew the risks of this work, but I thought I could keep it separate from our lives." Rebecca's exhaustion was evident in every line of her face. "What work, Michael? You've never told me exactly what you do. The mysterious phone calls, the sudden trips. What aren't you telling me?" But Michael couldn't reveal his FBI identity without potentially compromising ongoing operations. The wall of secrecy that had always existed in their marriage now felt insurmountable, adding another layer of isolation to their family's trauma. Meanwhile, Detective Lisa Park, who had taken Grace's case, found herself hitting dead ends at every turn. The partial license plate from Dorothy Kim's observation had led to a stolen vehicle that was found abandoned 3 states away. Security cameras in the neighborhood had malfunctioned that day, a coincidence that suggested professional planning. Without Grace's testimony describing her attacker, the case grew cold with frightening speed. "We need her to talk," Detective Park told the Sullivans during a follow-up meeting 6 weeks after the incident. "I understand the trauma she's experienced, but Grace is our only witness. Her description could be the key to catching this predator before he strikes again." The pressure only deepened Grace's retreat into silence. She began having violent nightmares that left her gasping and trembling, but unable to communicate what she had dreamed. Rebecca started sleeping in Grace's room, holding her daughter through the long nights when terror visited her sleep. Traditional therapy, art therapy, even music therapy, nothing penetrated Grace's protective silence. Rebecca researched every possible treatment, driving to specialists in Colorado Springs and Boulder, hoping someone could reach her daughter. The medical bills mounted while Grace seemed to drift further away from the world that had betrayed her trust. It was Dr. Rivers who finally suggested animal-assisted therapy. Sometimes children who can't trust humans can still connect with animals, she explained. There's something about the unconditional acceptance that dogs provide. They don't ask questions, don't judge, don't require verbal communication. Rebecca was initially skeptical. We've tried everything else. Why would a dog be different? Because dogs communicate primarily through body language and emotional energy, Dr. Rivers replied. Grace might feel safer with a creature that doesn't rely on words. The recommendation led them to Dr. Sarah Chen's Animal Rehabilitation Center on the outskirts of Denver. Dr. Chen specialized in matching traumatized children with therapy animals, often creatures who had experienced their own emotional wounds. Her facility housed dogs who had been retired from police work, military service, or rescue operations, animals who understood trauma from their own experiences. I have someone I'd like Grace to meet, Dr. Chen said during their initial visit. His name is Bear, and he's been through his own healing journey. Sometimes the wounded can help the wounded. Rebecca's first glimpse of Bear was intimidating. The German Shepherd was massive, with intelligent golden eyes and a jagged scar running down the left side of his face that spoke of violence and pain. He moved with the careful precision of a creature who had learned caution through bitter experience. He's so big, Rebecca whispered, instinctively protective. Won't he frighten her more? But Grace's reaction surprised everyone. For the first time in 2 months, she showed genuine interest in something outside herself. She stood transfixed by Bear's presence, not approaching, but not retreating either. The child who had pulled away from every human touch since the attack seemed drawn to this scarred guardian. Bear, for his part, remained perfectly still, his professional training evident in his patience. He had learned to read human trauma, to provide comfort without overwhelming vulnerable individuals. Something in Grace's silent stillness spoke to his own wounded heart. The meeting marked the beginning of a connection that would ultimately save them both. The first session at Dr. Chen's facility unfolded with the careful precision of a delicate dance. Grace sat in a small chair across the room from Bear, who remained in a relaxed downstay position, his golden eyes observing, but never demanding. Dr. Chen had learned through years of experience that forcing interaction between traumatized children and therapy animals often resulted in setbacks that could take weeks to overcome. Bear has been here for 3 years, Dr. Chen explained softly to Grace, though she didn't expect a response. He used to be a police dog, but he got hurt helping to save children. Now he helps children in a different way. Grace's eyes remained fixed on Bear's scar, that jagged line that told a story of violence survived. Perhaps she recognized something familiar in that mark, evidence that creatures could be wounded and continue living. Bear, sensing her attention, shifted slightly to offer her a better view of his face, an act of vulnerability that demonstrated his trust. Rebecca watched from a corner chair, her heart aching as she observed her daughter's first genuine interest in anything since the attack. Grace hadn't looked at people with such focus in months, her gaze usually sliding away from direct eye contact as if seeing others fully would make her too visible in return. Dr. Chen moved slowly around the room, explaining Bear's training and temperament while carefully monitoring Grace's body language. He knows when people are scared or sad, she continued. Dogs can smell emotions through chemical changes in our bodies. Bear is especially good at knowing when someone needs comfort. As if responding to his cue, Bear performed a subtle demonstration of his emotional intelligence. He noticed Grace's breathing had become shallow, a sign of rising anxiety, and gradually shifted his position to angle his body sideways rather than facing her directly. The movement reduced his apparent size and eliminated any perception of threat, a technique Dr. Chen had taught him for work with particularly traumatized children. The sessions continued 3 times a week for the next month. Progress was measured in the smallest increments. Grace allowing Bear to move 1 step closer, her breathing remaining calm when he shifted positions, the day she maintained eye contact with him for 30 seconds without looking away. Rebecca found herself living for these tiny victories, each one representing another thread reconnecting her daughter to the world. During the 4th week, something remarkable happened. Grace had been sitting in her usual chair, staring at Bear with her typical silent intensity when she slowly extended her hand toward him. Not close enough to touch, but the gesture itself was revolutionary. The first time since the attack that Grace had reached toward another living being. Bear remained perfectly still, allowing Grace to control the interaction entirely. His training had taught him that traumatized individuals needed to feel safe and in control before trust could develop. Dr. Chen held her breath, knowing that this moment could either represent a breakthrough or, if handled wrong, could cause Grace to retreat further into herself. Grace's small fingers trembled as they extended toward Bear's massive head. The size difference between them was striking, her tiny hand approaching a dog whose head was nearly as large as her torso. But Bear's stillness and patient expression conveyed safety rather than threat. When Grace's fingertips finally made contact with the soft fur between his ears, Bear's eyes closed in a gesture of complete submission and trust. The touch lasted only seconds before Grace pulled her hand back, but the impact was profound. For the first time in months, Rebecca saw something like peace cross her daughter's features. That night, Grace slept through without nightmares for the first time since the attack. Dr. Chen began introducing more structured activities designed to build communication between Grace and Bear. She taught Grace simple hand signals that Bear had learned during his police training, commands for sit, stay, and come that allowed Grace to feel a sense of control and accomplishment. The fact that Bear responded immediately to Grace's silent directions seemed to validate that communication could exist without words. The breakthrough came during the 8th week of therapy. Grace had been working with Bear on basic commands when she suddenly whispered so quietly that Dr. Chen almost missed it. "Good boy." Rebecca burst into tears, the first words her daughter had spoken in 4 months hitting her like a physical blow. Grace seemed surprised by her own voice, looking around as if wondering where the sound had come from. Bear's tail wagged slowly, his response conveying approval and encouragement without overwhelming her with excessive enthusiasm. "He likes it when you talk to him," Dr. Chen said gently. "Your voice makes him happy." From that day forward, Grace began speaking to Bear in whispers, their conversations inaudible to human ears but clearly meaningful to both participants. She told him about her nightmares, her fears, her confusion about why someone had tried to hurt her. Bear listened with the infinite patience that only dogs possess, never judging, never interrupting, simply accepting whatever she chose to share. Meanwhile, Michael's professional life had become increasingly complicated. His FBI task force had identified a pattern of attempted abductions across 3 states, all fitting the profile of the man who had attacked Grace. The pressure to solve the case was enormous, both from his superiors and from his own guilt at being unable to protect his daughter. He threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that worried his colleagues and further strained his marriage. Detective Lisa Park had stayed in regular contact with the Sullivan family, hoping that Grace's therapy sessions might eventually yield information useful to the investigation. The case remained frustratingly stagnant without eyewitness testimony, and she knew that similar attacks would continue until Thomas Mitchell was caught. "I understand this is difficult," Detective Park told Rebecca during one of their monthly check-ins. "But if Grace could eventually provide a description of her attacker, it might prevent other children from experiencing what she went through." Rebecca felt torn between her daughter's healing and the broader need for justice. Grace was making progress with Bear, but any mention of the attack still caused her to retreat into silence. The delicate balance of her recovery seemed too fragile to risk pushing for details about that traumatic afternoon. Dr. Chen suggested a gradual approach to help Grace process the attack without re-traumatizing her. "We can work on general safety concepts first," she proposed, teaching her to recognize dangerous situations and trust her instincts. If she becomes comfortable with those discussions, she might eventually be able to talk about what happened to her. The therapy sessions began incorporating role-playing scenarios where Grace could practice identifying safe versus unsafe situations. Bear played a crucial role in these exercises, his calm presence providing security while Grace learned to trust her intuitive responses to different scenarios. Gradually, she began to understand that the attack hadn't been her fault, and that some adults could be dangerous even when they appeared friendly. As Grace's confidence grew, she started speaking to Dr. Chen and occasionally to her mother, though her voice remained soft and tentative. The chattering, exuberant child she had been before the attack might never fully return. But a new version of Grace was emerging, more cautious but also more aware, still capable of joy but tempered by hard-won wisdom about the world's potential dangers. The most significant development came when Grace began having conversations with Bear that others could overhear. She would tell him stories, ask him questions, and share observations about their sessions. Dr. Chen realized that Bear had become Grace's bridge back to human communication, a safe intermediary who allowed her to practice using her voice without the vulnerability of direct human interaction. "We're ready for the next phase," Dr. Chen told Rebecca after 12 weeks of intensive therapy. "Grace has developed enough trust and communication skills that we can begin preparing her for situations where she might need to talk to other adults, including, eventually, law enforcement." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified Rebecca. Her daughter was healing, but the prospect of Grace having to relive her trauma for the sake of justice felt like asking too much of a child who had already endured so much. However, Grace herself made the decision that would change everything. During one of their sessions, she looked directly at Dr. Chen and said, "Bad man hurt other children too?" When Dr. Chen gently confirmed that this was possible, Grace's response was immediate and resolute. "Bear and me stop him." The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had seen countless trials over its 60-year history, but none quite like the one that began on a crisp October morning 6 months after Grace Sullivan's attack. The media attention was unprecedented. News vans lined the street, reporters clutched coffee cups in the pre-dawn chill, and protesters held signs demanding justice for trafficking victims. Inside the imposing stone building, Courtroom 4A buzzed with an energy that Judge Margaret Webb recognized as the intersection of high-stakes justice and public fascination. Thomas Mitchell sat at the defense table in a perfectly pressed navy suit, his appearance carefully crafted to project innocence and respectability. At 43, he possessed the kind of unremarkable features that allowed him to blend into crowds. Average height, thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. His defense attorney, Marcus Reynolds, was one of Denver's most expensive criminal lawyers, known for his ability to create reasonable doubt in seemingly impossible cases. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had built their case methodically over the past months. DNA evidence linked Mitchell to 3 other attempted abductions. Security footage placed him near victim locations, and digital forensics had uncovered a sophisticated network of encrypted communications. But they all knew that Grace Sullivan's testimony would be the keystone that could ensure Mitchell never walked free again. Grace entered the courtroom holding Rebecca's hand, her small figure dwarfed by the massive chamber's mahogany panels and soaring ceiling. She wore a simple blue dress with the same red silk ribbon woven through her hair, a detail that several reporters would later describe as a symbol of resilience. Behind them walked Dr. Chen, who would remain nearby throughout the proceedings, ready to intervene if Grace became overwhelmed. But it was Bear who commanded the most attention. The German shepherd moved with calm dignity beside Grace, his service vest clearly marking his official role. His presence had been the subject of heated pre-trial arguments, with the defense claiming that a large dog in the courtroom would prejudice the jury against their client. Judge Webb had ultimately ruled that Bear's therapeutic necessity outweighed any potential bias, noting that Grace's ability to testify at all depended on his presence. "This is highly irregular," Marcus Reynolds had argued during the pre-trial hearing. "The defendant has a right to a fair trial, not a theatrical production designed to manipulate the jury's emotions." "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Webb had replied, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the bench, "this child has endured trauma that would break most adults. If a therapy dog allows her to participate in these proceedings, then justice demands we accommodate that need." Now, watching Grace take her place in the witness section with Bear settling beside her chair, Judge Webb felt the weight of that decision. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the small girl surveyed the sea of faces staring back at her. Grace's hand found Bear's head, her fingers threading through his thick fur in a gesture that had become her source of strength. District Attorney Walsh approached the witness stand with careful deliberation. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with Dr. Chen to develop questioning techniques that would allow Grace to communicate without re-traumatizing her. The stakes couldn't be higher. Mitchell's conviction could unravel an entire trafficking network that had operated across 3 states for nearly a decade. "Good morning, Grace," Walsh began, her voice gentle but clear. "I know this is scary, but you're very brave for being here today. Can you tell us your name?" Grace's response was barely audible. "Grace Elizabeth Sullivan." "And how old are you, Grace?" 6 3/4, Grace replied, her voice growing slightly stronger. The specificity of her age drew sympathetic smiles from several jurors, humanizing her in a way that legal briefs and evidence photos could never achieve. Walsh continued with basic questions, allowing Grace to become comfortable with the rhythm of testimony. Throughout the questioning, Bear remained perfectly still, his presence a constant source of security. Grace's hand never left his head, her fingers occasionally moving in subtle patterns that Dr. Chen recognized as the calming signals they had practiced during therapy sessions. The real test came when Walsh approached the events of April 15th. "Grace, I want to ask you about the day when someone tried to hurt you." "I know it's hard to remember, but it's very important that you try. Can you tell us what happened in your backyard that day?" Grace's breathing quickened, and Bear responded immediately, shifting his position slightly to press closer to her chair. The movement was subtle but clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. Several jurors leaned forward, recognizing the dog's protective instinct. "A man came," Grace whispered, her voice so soft that Judge Webb had to ask the court reporter to confirm she was capturing the testimony. "He said he had puppies that needed help." "What did this man look like, Grace? Can you describe him?" For the first time since taking the stand, Grace looked directly across the courtroom toward the defense table. Thomas Mitchell met her gaze with what appeared to be mild curiosity, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers pressed against the table's surface. "He had glasses like my teacher," Grace said, her voice gaining strength, "and he smiled too much, like when grown-ups pretend to be nice but they're not really nice inside." The observation was devastatingly accurate, cutting through Mitchell's carefully constructed facade with a child's intuitive understanding of deception. Several jurors glanced toward the defendant, perhaps wondering what Grace had seen that adults might miss. "Grace, this is very important," Walsh continued. "Do you see that man in the courtroom today?" Grace's small hand moved in what appeared to be a random gesture, her fingers tracing a pattern in Bear's fur that looked like nervous fidgeting to most observers. But Dr. Chen recognized the signal immediately, a specific movement they had practiced during therapy sessions, a way for Grace to communicate when words became too difficult. Bear's reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his body going rigid with alertness. A low, rumbling growl began deep in his chest, growing in intensity until it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. His golden eyes locked onto Thomas Mitchell with an intensity that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Webb's gavel struck repeatedly as she called for order, but the damage was done. Bear had communicated more clearly than any human witness could have. He recognized Thomas Mitchell as a threat. Marcus Reynolds shot to his feet. "Objection! This is exactly the kind of prejudicial theater we warned against. A dog's behavior cannot be considered evidence." But Judge Webb was staring at Bear with growing realization. She had spent enough years observing human behavior to recognize authentic responses versus performed ones. The dog's reaction wasn't trained behavior, it was pure instinct, the kind of recognition that came from previous encounters with danger. "Mr. Reynolds," she said slowly, "I'm going to allow this testimony to continue. The court notes that the animal appears to be responding to some form of recognition." Thomas Mitchell's composure finally cracked. For months, he had maintained his innocence with practiced ease, confident that a traumatized child's testimony could be discredited. But Bear's recognition suggested a connection that Mitchell couldn't explain away. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Mitchell seemed transfixed by the dog's unwavering stare. In the gallery, grandmother Evelyn Porter dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. At 82, she had attended the trial every day, drawn by a sense of justice that reminded her of her own generation's faith in doing what was right. "That sweet child," she murmured to her neighbor. "And that brave dog knows exactly who hurt her." The prosecution had achieved something unprecedented, a moment of truth so pure that it transcended legal technicalities and procedural arguments. Bear hadn't just recognized Thomas Mitchell, he had identified him as someone who had previously threatened children. The implications were staggering, suggesting that Mitchell's crimes extended far beyond the attack on Grace. As court recessed for the day, Grace remained calm despite the courtroom's chaos. Bear's presence had allowed her to speak her truth without being overwhelmed by fear. For the first time since the attack, she felt that adults were finally listening, finally understanding what she had tried to communicate through months of silence. Dr. Chen helped Grace down from the witness stand, noting the child's improved posture and steady breathing. The testimony had been traumatic but also healing. Grace had faced her attacker and found her voice. Bear walked beside them with quiet dignity, his role as protector and healer complete. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about the dog's dramatic reaction, but the Sullivan family pushed through the crowd toward their car. Rebecca held Grace close while Michael, whose FBI identity remained secret, scanned the crowd for potential threats. The trial was far from over, but they had achieved something remarkable. Grace had spoken her truth, and Bear had confirmed it in a way that no jury could ignore. The second day of trial began with an atmosphere thick with tension and anticipation. Word of Bear's dramatic recognition had spread through social media overnight, with hashtags like #JusticeForGrace and #BearKnows trending across platforms. The courthouse steps were packed with supporters holding signs reading, "Children deserve protection," and "Listen to the voiceless." Grandmother Evelyn Porter had organized a prayer circle that included dozens of elderly community members, their weathered faces reflecting a determination that transcended generational boundaries. Inside the courtroom, Thomas Mitchell appeared noticeably different from the previous day. His confident demeanor had been replaced by visible anxiety, fidgeting hands, darting glances toward Bear, and whispered conversations with his attorney that grew increasingly urgent. Marcus Reynolds had clearly spent the night developing a new strategy to counter the devastating impact of the dog's recognition. "Your Honor," Reynolds began as proceedings resumed, "we move for an immediate mistrial. The events of yesterday were nothing short of orchestrated theater designed to prejudice this jury against my client. A dog's behavior cannot and should not be considered evidence in a court of law." Judge Webb studied the defense attorney with the measured gaze of someone who had seen every legal maneuver attempted over 4 decades. "Mr. Reynolds, your objection is noted and overruled." The court observed what appeared to be genuine recognition behavior, not trained performance. "We will proceed." District Attorney Walsh stood to continue Grace's testimony, but before she could speak, Dr. Chen approached the bench with obvious concern. "Your Honor, I need to inform the court that Grace experienced severe nightmares last night following her testimony. While she's determined to continue, I'm worried about the psychological impact of prolonged questioning." The revelation sent a ripple of protective anger through the gallery. Rebecca Sullivan's face crumpled as she struggled to contain her emotions, while Michael's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. The sight of their daughter's continued suffering was almost unbearable, yet they knew that retreating now would mean Thomas Mitchell might escape justice entirely. Grace herself seemed smaller that morning, her usual red ribbon replaced by a simple hairband, as if even that small symbol of normalcy had become too much to bear. Bear sensed her distress immediately, positioning himself closer to her chair and occasionally nuzzling her hand with gentle encouragement. Their bond had become the only thing allowing her to function in this terrifying adult world of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. As Walsh resumed questioning, attempting to establish more details about the attack, Grace's responses became increasingly fragmented. Her voice dropped to barely audible whispers, and she began showing signs of dissociation that Dr. Chen recognized as protective psychological responses to overwhelming stress. "Grace, sweetheart," Walsh said gently, "can you tell us what the man said to you about the puppies?" But Grace had retreated too far into herself to respond coherently. Her small body began trembling, and Bear immediately moved to full alert status, his protective instincts overriding his courtroom training. The German Shepherd positioned himself between Grace and the rest of the courtroom, creating a physical barrier that made it clear he would tolerate no further distress to his charge. It was then that the first devastating blow struck the prosecution's case. Dr. Amanda Rivers, Grace's original therapist, took the stand as a defense witness. Reynolds had clearly convinced her to testify about the unreliability of trauma memories in young children. "Dr. Rivers," Reynolds began, "in your professional opinion, how reliable are the memories of a 6-year-old child who has experienced severe psychological trauma?" "Trauma can significantly distort memory formation," Dr. Rivers replied reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with where the questioning was heading. "Children Grace's age are particularly susceptible to false memory implantation and suggestion. What they believe they remember may not accurately reflect actual events." The testimony hit the Sullivan family like a physical blow. Rebecca gasped audibly, while Michael's hands clenched into fists. They had trusted Dr. Rivers with their daughter's care, and now she was essentially calling Grace's testimony unreliable. The betrayal felt almost as devastating as the original attack, but the worst was yet to come. During the lunch recess, FBI agent Sandra Martinez approached Michael with information that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the case. Her face was grim as she pulled him aside in the courthouse corridor. "Michael, we've uncovered something that changes everything," she said quietly. "Thomas Mitchell isn't working alone. We've identified what appears to be an organized trafficking network spanning 3 states. 12 children are currently missing, and we believe Mitchell is the only person who knows their location." The implications were staggering. "What are you saying?" Michael asked, though he already feared the answer. "We're saying that if we convict Mitchell without getting information about those children first, they could disappear forever. His associates will move them, and we'll lose any chance of rescue. We need him to cooperate, which means we might have to offer him a plea deal." Michael felt the world collapse around him. Justice for Grace might mean condemning 12 other children to continued captivity or worse. The choice was impossible. Save his daughter's attacker to save other children, or pursue justice while potentially sacrificing innocent lives. The moral complexity of the situation became even more devastating when Grace overheard part of the conversation and made a declaration that would haunt everyone present. "If bad man knows where other children are, we have to help them, even if it means he doesn't get punished for hurting me." The revelation about the 12 missing children transformed the trial from a pursuit of justice into an impossible moral equation. That evening, the Sullivan family gathered in their living room with FBI agent Martinez, District Attorney Walsh, and Dr. Chen to discuss options that seemed to offer only heartbreak regardless of which path they chose. Grace sat quietly on the floor beside Bear, her small hands absently stroking his fur, while the adults debated her future and the fate of children she would never meet. "The trafficking network operates like a hydra," Agent Martinez explained, her voice heavy with the weight of cases that had haunted her career. "Cut off one head, and 2 more appear. But Mitchell is different. He's the coordinator, the one who maintains the database of locations and transport schedules. Without him, the entire operation fragments, but those 12 children become ghosts." Michael paced the room like a caged animal, his FBI training warring with his paternal instincts. "So you're asking us to let the man who traumatized our daughter walk free in exchange for information that might save other children? What guarantee do we have that he'll honor any agreement?" "We don't," Walsh admitted. "But federal prosecutors are prepared to offer him 25 years instead of life without parole. He serves significant time, but not the maximum sentence, and the plea agreement would require him to provide detailed information about every location, every contact, every child currently in the network." Rebecca's voice cracked with exhaustion and moral anguish. "How do we explain to Grace that her attacker gets a reduced sentence? How do we tell her that speaking up, being brave, might not result in full justice?" It was Grace herself who broke the deadlock with a wisdom that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old to possess. "Mama," she said quietly, her voice carrying a clarity that silenced every adult in the room. "If the bad man knows where other little girls are hurt, we have to help them first. Bear would want to save them. Wouldn't you, Bear?" The German shepherd's tail wagged once as if confirming her assessment. Dr. Chen knelt beside Grace, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Grace, do you understand what this means? It means the man who tried to hurt you might not go to prison for as long as we wanted." Grace nodded solemnly. "But other children get to go home to their mamas. That's more important than being mad at the bad man." The moral sophistication of her response left the adults speechless. Here was a child who had endured trauma that would break many adults, choosing compassion over vengeance, prioritizing the welfare of strangers over her own sense of justice. Bear seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing closer to Grace's side in a gesture of support that acknowledged her sacrifice. But the decision came with devastating consequences that became apparent the next morning. Thomas Mitchell, emboldened by the plea negotiations, returned to court with renewed confidence. His attorney had clearly informed him about the FBI's desperation to locate the missing children, and he used that knowledge like a weapon. "My client is prepared to provide information about the alleged missing children," Marcus Reynolds announced during an emergency hearing, "but only after a formal plea agreement is signed and approved by this court. Until then, he maintains his complete innocence regarding the charges against him." Judge Webb's face hardened with disgust. "Mr. Reynolds, your client is essentially holding those children hostage to negotiate his own sentence. This court finds such tactics morally reprehensible." "Your Honor, my client is simply exercising his constitutional rights. If the prosecution believes other crimes have been committed, they're free to investigate independently. My client has no obligation to assist them without appropriate considerations." The legal maneuvering continued for hours while precious time ticked away. Grace sat in the witness waiting room with Bear and Dr. Chen, aware that her testimony might now be rendered meaningless by plea negotiations. The child who had found the courage to speak her truth was watching it become secondary to larger strategic considerations. Meanwhile, FBI teams across 3 states were conducting desperate searches based on partial information gleaned from previous investigations. Warehouses, abandoned buildings, remote cabins, anywhere that might house a trafficking operation. But without Mitchell's specific knowledge, they were searching blindly while children remained in danger. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Bear, who had remained unusually agitated throughout the morning, suddenly displayed behavior that Dr. Chen had never witnessed before. As Mitchell passed through the courthouse corridor flanked by marshals, the German shepherd began exhibiting what could only be described as hunting behavior. Nose to the ground, muscles tensed, following a scent trail with laser focus. "He's tracking something," Dr. Chen whispered to Agent Martinez. "This isn't his normal protective behavior. He's following a specific scent." Bear led them through the courthouse parking garage to a black sedan that had been impounded as evidence from Mitchell's residence. The moment he approached the vehicle, his behavior intensified. He pawed at the trunk, whined with urgency, and looked back at the humans with an expression that clearly communicated discovery. Forensic specialists immediately processed the vehicle more thoroughly than before. Hidden compartments revealed GPS devices programmed with coordinates to 3 specific locations. One address led to an abandoned warehouse 20 miles outside Denver, where FBI agents found evidence of recent habitation, food containers, bedding, and children's clothing that had been hastily abandoned. The second location yielded the breakthrough that changed everything. A rural cabin contained computer equipment with encrypted files detailing the entire trafficking network. More importantly, it held recent photographs of 12 children, including metadata that provided clues about their current location. "The cabin's been abandoned for less than 48 hours, Agent Martinez reported to the emergency task force. "They're moving the operation, but they can't have gone far with that many children." Bear's contribution had provided law enforcement with the first real leads they'd had in months. The dog, who had been retired from active duty due to trauma, had somehow retained investigative instincts that proved crucial to the case. His ability to connect scent memories with current evidence demonstrated the remarkable capabilities that had made him legendary during his police career. But even with these discoveries, time was running out. Intelligence suggested that the trafficking network was prepared to dispose of evidence, a euphemism that chilled everyone involved, rather than risk exposure through a lengthy investigation. The 12 children had perhaps hours before their captors decided they had become too dangerous to keep alive. Grace, unaware of these developments, made a decision that would define the rest of the case. She approached District Attorney Walsh with Bear at her side and made a request that demonstrated courage beyond her years. "I want to talk to the bad man," she said quietly. "Maybe if he sees that I'm not scared anymore, he'll tell you where the other children are." The proposal was unprecedented, dangerous, and possibly the only hope remaining for 12 innocent lives. Judge Webb would have to approve a meeting between a 6-year-old trauma survivor and her attacker, a decision that would test every principle of justice, child protection, and legal precedent. The meeting took place in a secure conference room within the federal courthouse, its sterile white walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere that felt more like a medical procedure than a conversation. Grace sat in a child-sized chair with Bear positioned protectively beside her, while Thomas Mitchell faced them across a metal table, his hands shackled to a chain around his waist. Dr. Chen monitored from one corner, ready to intervene at the first sign of distress, while FBI agents observed through one-way glass. Judge Webb had reluctantly approved the meeting after consultation with child psychologists and law enforcement experts. "This is unprecedented," she had warned during the emergency hearing. "But if there's even a chance that this child's courage could save 12 lives, we must explore every option." Grace looked directly at Mitchell for the first time since the attack, her small frame steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Bear's ears remained alert, his golden eyes never leaving the man who had tried to steal Grace's innocence and safety. The dog's presence seemed to give Grace strength she wouldn't have possessed alone. "Hello," Grace said quietly, her voice carrying none of the fear that had characterized her testimony days earlier. "My name is Grace Sullivan. You tried to take me away from my mama." Mitchell's carefully constructed facade began to crack as he stared at the child he had traumatized. Perhaps he had expected tears, terror, or the broken silence that had defined Grace for months. Instead, he faced a small girl whose courage seemed to fill the sterile room with unexpected power. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mitchell replied, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed in court. Something about Grace's direct gaze and calm demeanor was clearly unsettling him. "Yes, you do," Grace responded with the unflinching honesty that only children possess. "You told me you had puppies that needed help, but you were lying because you wanted to hurt me. Bear knows you were lying too." As if summoned by his name, Bear shifted position slightly, his movement subtle but enough to make Mitchell flinch. The German Shepherd had said nothing, done nothing aggressive, yet his presence conveyed recognition and judgment in ways that transcended human communication. Grace continued with a wisdom that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old. "Dr. Chen taught me that sometimes people do bad things because bad things happened to them when they were little. Did someone hurt you when you were my age?" The question hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His composure shattered completely as unexpected tears began streaming down his face. "I was 7, he whispered, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "My foster father. He said I was helping other children by letting him practice." "Doctor." Chen leaned forward, recognizing the breakthrough they had all hoped for but dreaded experiencing. Mitchell's confession of childhood abuse provided context for his crimes without excusing them, revealing the cycle of trauma that had created a predator from a victim. "That was very bad," Grace said simply. "But hurting other children doesn't make your hurt go away. It just makes more hurt in the world." Mitchell sobbed openly now, years of buried anguish and guilt pouring out in front of the child he had tried to victimize. "I know," he choked out. "I know it's wrong. I've tried to stop, but I can't. There's something broken inside me." "Where are the other children?" Grace asked with gentle directness. They need to go home to their families like I got to go home to mine. The room fell silent, except for Mitchell's ragged breathing. FBI agents behind the glass held their breath, knowing that the next few moments could determine whether 12 children lived or died. Grace waited patiently, her small hand resting on Bear's head in a gesture that had become her source of strength. "There's a compound in Wyoming," Mitchell finally whispered. "Abandoned religious retreat near Jackson Hole. The children are being held there while arrangements are made for transport overseas." Agent Martinez immediately began coordinating with Wyoming authorities through her earpiece, her voice urgent but controlled. "How many adults at the location? What kind of security measures?" Mitchell provided details with the broken voice of a man finally unburdened of secrets that had consumed his soul. Guard rotations, building layouts, vehicle descriptions, information that would allow law enforcement to plan a rescue operation with minimal risk to the captive children. But it was Grace's next question that provided the most crucial intelligence. "Are they hurt? The other children?" "No," Mitchell replied, his voice thick with self-loathing. "They're kept sedated but unharmed. The buyers prefer them undamaged." The clinical nature of his language sent chills through everyone present, but it also confirmed that the children were likely alive and recoverable. Dr. Chen made notes for the trauma counseling that would be required for all 12 victims, knowing that their psychological healing would be as important as their physical rescue. As FBI teams across the region mobilized for the Wyoming operation, Grace made one final statement that would be remembered by everyone present. "I forgive you," she said to Mitchell, her words carrying a maturity that transcended her 6 years. "Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying hate makes my heart heavy. Bear taught me that protecting people is better than punishing people." Mitchell collapsed completely at her words, his sobs echoing in the sterile room. Perhaps for the first time since his own childhood trauma, he was experiencing genuine remorse rather than the calculated manipulation that had characterized his adult life. The rescue operation unfolded with military precision 6 hours later. Wyoming SWAT teams surrounded the compound at dawn, using intelligence provided by Mitchell to neutralize security and locate the children. All 12 victims were found alive in a converted dormitory building, unconscious from sedatives but physically unharmed. The youngest victim was 4 years old, the oldest 14, children who had been missing for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 8 months. Their families received phone calls that would transform the worst periods of their lives into joyous reunions, though the healing process would take years of careful therapy and support. Back in Denver, Grace watched news coverage of the rescue with Bear curled beside her on the living room couch. Her parents flanked her on either side, finally able to breathe freely after months of terror and uncertainty. The child who had lost her voice to trauma had found it again through courage, using her pain to prevent others from experiencing similar suffering. "Did we help them, Bear?" Grace asked, scratching behind the German shepherd's scarred ears. "Did we save the other children?" Bear's tail wagged slowly, his golden eyes reflecting contentment that came from purpose fulfilled. The retired police dog had found his way back to active service through an unlikely partnership with a traumatized child, proving that healing could create strength rather than just survival. Dr. Chen arrived that evening with news that would transform Grace's recovery from personal triumph into national inspiration. "Grace, there are reporters who want to tell your story, not about the scary parts, but about how you found your voice again and used it to help other children. Would you like to help other boys and girls who are scared like you were?" Grace considered the question with the serious contemplation she brought to all important decisions. "Will Bear be with me?" "Always," Dr. Chen promised. "You two are a team now." Judge Webb visited the Sullivan home the following week, bringing official commendation letters and a personal message that moved the entire family to tears. "Grace," she said, kneeling to the child's eye level, "in 40 years of presiding over trials, I have never witnessed courage like yours. You turned your pain into power and your trauma into triumph." The legal proceedings concluded with Mitchell pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for his cooperation in dismantling the trafficking network. He received 25 years in federal prison with mandatory psychological treatment and no possibility of early release. While some criticized the reduced sentence, most agreed that saving 12 lives justified the compromise. Grace's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Her story inspired legislation requiring therapy animals in child testimony cases, funding for trauma-informed legal procedures, and expanded support for child trafficking victims. The Grace Sullivan Act became federal law within a year, ensuring that other young witnesses would have access to the same support that had made her testimony possible. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal. Grace Sullivan had transformed from a silenced victim into a voice for the voiceless, proving that even the smallest among us could create change that echoed across generations. And beside her, every step of the way walked Bear, the scarred warrior who had found his greatest purpose in protecting a child who taught him that heroes come in all sizes. Their bond had healed them both, creating something stronger from their shared brokenness. Proof that love and courage could triumph over even the darkest chapters of human experience. Dear friends, Grace Sullivan's story reminds us that healing isn't about age, it's about heart. At 6 years old, this brave child chose forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair, and protecting others over protecting herself. She found her voice not through anger, but through love. Her partnership with Bear, a scarred German shepherd who had lost his way, proves that broken souls can mend each other when they refuse to give up on goodness. In our golden years, we've all faced moments that tested our faith in humanity. We've seen darkness that made us question whether decency still exists in this world. But Grace's courage and Bear's unwavering loyalty shows us that even the smallest acts of bravery can create ripples that save lives. Their bond reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose, to speak truth, and to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Sometimes the most profound healing comes when we focus on lifting others rather than nursing our own wounds. Grace taught a courtroom full of adults that forgiveness doesn't excuse evil. It frees us to fight it more effectively. What moment in your life required the kind of courage Grace showed? Have you ever experienced the healing power of an unexpected friendship like Grace and Bear's? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.